Does classical Sicilian include the e5 push? It can, but I think it's kind of up to black. But I mean, it's not really the move that's the problem. I mean, if the idea is bad, the idea is bad. But if the idea works in some positions, then you can't just reject the move e5 outright, because in some positions e5 is a great move. I'll give you one example actually. You know what? For this, we can make an analysis board because this is hopefully useful. But if we take this position, does anyone know this one? Does anyone know why, like, why this move is actually kind of annoying for white? Oh, Kamsky played this one. Yeah, that makes sense, actually. I feel like Gata loves these kind of sidelines. So, yeah, the problem is, like, for white, if you go d4, takes, black goes knight f6, knight c3, and then e5. So you guys are pointing this out. And this is actually, yeah, a fantastic move, because black essentially just gets a brilliant Sveshnikov. You get a Sveshnikov where white cannot go knight db5. You know, think about that. Like, get a and if knight f5, then d5, and white has issues with this knight, and it's not so good. So this is already, like, I mean, black is like comfortable here. Black is like slightly more comfortable already. Bishop b4, it's pressure here. You go d5, and the point is we played e5 in one move, and we played a6, so there was no trouble on b5. Now we get d5 in one move for black as well. Compare this to the Najdorf real quick. Does anyone know why black doesn't just play e5 here? Because the Najdorf move is, of course, this one. And then when black plays e5 here, white cannot jump to this square. But what's the reason that black can't play this one? Okay, Chesterfish says bishop b5 check. Good. And then on bishop d7, what would be the point here? Yeah, knight f5. Well, basically nothing too complicated. Yeah, you just basically trade. I'm sure this is in the Sicilian book, yeah. And then you go knight f5. But I think this is really important to understand, because players, I think they get confused with all these, like, different variations and, like, what's the line called, and then, you know, you get these ideas like, oh, e5 is a bad move or it's not a bad move. Like, no, it just depends on the details of the position, and you have to evaluate things on, like, a case-by-case basis. So, yeah, in this one, after the trade of bishops, white just gets this fantastic square. Black can go like g6 or something, the knight comes back here, and, like, we just get this, like, beautiful control over the d5 square. So white's knights are just, like, perfectly set up. The reason that the Sveshnikov works, and that black can get away with it, because, I mean, Magnus and others are playing this one at the highest level. I mean, this one has been played the highest level for, like, many years now, right? If it was a bad opening, we would have busted it by now. But the reason it works is because white's knight doesn't get anywhere near the e3 square. So knight a3, b5, and our knight is terrible. And it's no surprise that b5 is the main move, and in fact, if black does not play b5, let's say black plays like bishop e6 or bishop e7, does anyone know white's best move in this position? And this is either one you know or one, you know, you just kind of figure out logically. Knight c4, exactly. Sorry, I blocked the board for a sec. Knight c4 is the point, and white gets his knight, or her knight, to the dream e3 square. So This one is, I mean, I don't know, maybe it's playable, but basically it's usually been considered kind of healthy for white, very healthy. And that's why b5 is such an important move here, because it really takes white a lot of time to get this knight back into play. Now white has to play like knight d5, c3, knight c2, takes a million more moves. So the Sveshnikov works because black gets all this time and then can create their counterplay, you know, like on, well, on knight d5 here, there's bishop e7, and then we have to take this one, and black gets their dark square bishop, and we'll get their counterplay based on the dark squares. Okay, so then why is the a6 line bad? Great question. I don't actually think it's like terrible. Actually, Artemiev played this one several times against Anish Giri in their Speed Chess Championship match, and Giri wasn't really able to demonstrate like such a huge advantage here. It's long been considered that white has two moves here, c3 and c4. And both are considered good, because if you play c3, then we basically get a c3 Sicilian, but where black has played a6 and white has played knight f3, and this move is normal, and this a6 move is kind of unnecessary. But I would say it's not like totally clear, like Artemiev would just play takes, queen takes d5, and yeah, Giri wasn't really able to prove an advantage here. So there might be something for white, but you really have to kind of know specifically how to tackle this. Like d4 is the move, and black has different options. There's like knight c6, bishop g4, knight f6, e6, a lot of different ways of playing this position. And then the other way you can play is c4, where you actually get more of a con Sicilian, because black will often play e6, and then after d4 takes, we transpose to the con, where white has played c4. And I mean, this is a perfectly acceptable position for black. It's very playable, but then it kind of begs the question, you know, like, well, if that's what you want, then, you know, just why not just play the con outright? Why allow white this extra option with c3? Now it's true, on c3, black can also go e6, d4, d5. But if we compare this to the French, this a6 move is not really black's first choice, right? If we just play e5, white gets kind of a nicer version of the advanced French. Not that this is what white wants to do necessarily. They might not like the French in general, but that is kind of a drawback, because here black would have already wanted to have played knight c6 and then has like queen b6 and bishop d7 and all these other lines. Whereas this line with a6, I think, is not black's top choice here. Hey, Shinksbach, thanks for following. Now, my opinion on this one is that white should just go knight c3, actually. So a third move enters the equation. I like this one because actually I feel like white can just transpose to a lot of other things. Now, it doesn't work for everybody. For example, if black plays e6 here, you go d4, takes. This works for my repertoire against the con Sicilian, because on queen c7, I want to go g3 here, and I like this setup. But if you're someone who wants to play the c4 line against the con, then this doesn't really work for you, and instead you should play c4 in this position. Or if, for example, you want to play the line with bishop d3, this is not a good version of it, because our knight on c3 actually gets hit with b5. If you want to play this version against the con, now we're really getting into the weeds here, but hopefully, again, it's instructive. It's much better to play it here without knight c3, and the difference is that on queen c7, let's say we castle, whenever black goes b5 in these positions, which con players really like to do, white hits them with a4. And it's kind of important here that black doesn't have b4 hitting the knight on c3, right? So this knight on b1 is actually kind of nice for white, because then on b4, white can play knight d2, bring the knight to c4, and has a very pleasant development. I knew what you play against Sicilian. That's funny. So yeah, that means if you're someone who wants to play this line, which I think is a really good line, usually it's like d6 and queen e2, knight f6, c4, and then white goes knight c3 and so on, then it's playing knight c3 is not really going to work for your move order. But okay, this is just move order stuff. This is just only specific if you if you play these lines. But what I like about this one is that if you're okay with it, then there's no drawback from a move order point of view, as long as this works for your repertoire. So if black goes e6, we just get a con. If black goes d6, then you can play d4 here, takes, and on e5, this is very important, guys. This is the most important part of this whole lecture. Anyone have any ideas what's the right move here? Jesse's miserable. Glad to hear it. Yeah, this is an important question. I'm glad we're pausing here because this is like, this is crucial. This is the whole thing. This is just all about this position basically, because black has got an a6 in and they got e5 in, and if we play knight b3 here, then black just gets everything. They just get like perfect Najdorf, or if we play knight f3, then again they get like a very nice Najdorf where they avoid all of like the most dangerous lines. No, the critical move is knight f5, because we don't let black get away with this, because the problem with knight f5 is always d5, but our knight is on c3 here, so on d5 we're just taking this one and we're totally fine. So it's always been about this f5 square. It's always been about this f5 square, right? Like if we just look at any other opening, like the Najdorf wouldn't work. Let's say bishop e3, e5. This wouldn't work if white could just go knight f5. But on knight f5, there's d5, and because there's now a knight on f6 covering this square, black can get away with this one. Which means white cannot get away with knight f5, and then in this position, white has to go knight b3 or knight f3. These are secondary options. Our first choice is knight f5 here. Right? Think about the e5 line. It was all about this f5 square. Why can't black go e5 in this position? Like if we had to play knight b5 here, black would be totally fine. This is just a Sveshnikov, and this is playable. But no, there's bishop b5 check, bishop d7, and then we get the f5 square. So it's all about this f5 square. Yeah, I remember the Shanklin lecture. That was a very cool point when, yeah, he was showing like the rook e8 bishop d8 maneuver. If you guys haven't seen that, it's like one of our clips. You should just look for it. Is e5 premature? Yeah. So here e5, I mean it's a move, they used to play it, but yeah, nowadays no one really plays this one because of the check. So that's what I think we have to kind of maybe remember about like a lot of move orders, is that nothing is ever for free, you know? Like black just can't have everything. So the a6 line, this is an example of black trying to get everything, and they almost get it. That's why I think this is like honestly one of the most devious, definitely one of the most devious opening traps out there. Much more devious than anything you'll see on Twitter or YouTube or Reddit. This is the most devious trap out there because it makes white's main move an inaccuracy. Like, can you imagine d4? Like no one seeing this position for the first time in their life would believe that d4 could be a bad move here. No one. Like, and yeah, every time, like, you know, I have a student who's like 1200 and, you know, they play like the Open Sicilian, they always fall for this. Everyone does, because it's just natural. Like d4, like if you're playing the Open Sicilian, you play d4, right? That's what you do against literally every move. Like every single move. Maybe not knight f6. Okay, we go e5. But on a6, seemingly the most inconsequential move in the position, all of a sudden d4 is now like a mistake. So that's kind of, I mean, that's pretty incredible. But again, here black gets knight f6, knight c3, and gets e5, and didn't even have to play d6. So here black just gets the best of all worlds. Knight b5, d5. Oh, so what's the refutation? Well, I mentioned this a little while ago, but instead of d4, white is happy after c3. You get a good version of the c3 Sicilian. Or you can play c4, and you get a good version of the Morrazy lines, like in the Khan, for example. The idea would be to always play d4 then, and now we're not really worried about any of these e5 lines. Now that white has gone in c4 and black would have to spend another tempo. What would be the right move here, guys? Critical question. e5. What should white do? Knight f5, good. So the rule is not so much whether the knight is on f6 or not. The rule is more about, can black play d5? If they can play d5, then no good. If they can't play d5, we have it under control, then it's absolutely fine. So if we add a knight and a knight to the equation, then after e5, again, we can go knight f5 and we're happy. So even here you can do it, even though there's a knight on f6, but the point is we're controlling d5, so there's no d5 break. And if there's no d5 break, then we're golden. The knight comes back to e3, dream square, and covers everything. Yeah, this will definitely go on YouTube. This is definitely going on YouTube. Knight c2 is also not bad, actually, just for the same reason that you're heading to e3. So the knight on c2 is also well placed in these positions. Oh, just to show the trap from earlier. So if white falls for this one, the point here is black goes knight f6, knight c3, e5. And here we don't have knight f5. We don't have our kind of desired move because here black has d5, the knight is caught, and we just don't have enough attackers on the d5 square because the knight is always hanging. So if white goes knight f5 and a Sveshnikov is a refutation in d5. Let's take a look at it, actually. Let's see. So we go for the old Svesh, e5. Yeah, if knight f5 in this position, exactly, d5 should be working for black. Even though it feels like we actually have 3 on it, the point is that this e-pawn is not a real defender. It's overloaded. So, and there are some endgames like takes, like this or something, but for the most part, black is just fine. So that's why white has to go the other way. Okay. You know what, guys? I think we're having fun. Let's kick it up a notch. Let's kick it up a notch. Let's say black plays a6 here. Threatening e5, where again we wouldn't have knight f5 or knight b5. What should white do? Legion says bishop takes c6 and e5. Let's go. Take the knight and e5. Okay, good. Yeah, this would be kind of the first idea we want to look for. Bishop c4 might not be bad for the reason that on e5 we could absolutely play knight f5 here. So this is definitely a solid idea as well. I think this move is certainly not bad, but probably more critical would be taking and then pushing e5 because this knight just doesn't have a good square. And if black goes dc, as far as I remember, these endgames are pretty unpleasant because we go bishop f4 and then we're castling and black's king just doesn't have a good square. And exactly, on BC we're playing e5 and there's no queen a5 check. So the details here are obviously really, really important. If we look at this position, if we try the simple takes e5, of course, this is how a lot of players say goodbye to their pawn. And then they go here, and then black takes this one, and then black takes this one, and then, like, you know, all 3 results possible. But that's how those games usually go. But once the knight is on c3, So this is why it's important not to get stuck with like rules, because if you have some kind of thinking in your head like, oh, e5 is always bad, e5 is a blunder, then you won't find the right moment to play it, and that's tragic. So in the Sicilian, it's really important to try to be concrete. So yeah, when black goes here, we really got to make sure that we punish it and we don't let black get away with it. And this one, okay, if black has to go back here, this is not fun, right? Then we're just developing. We go queen e2, castle queenside, rook he1. You try to make a miniature, you know, you play a miniature. Okay. There's one more really important example of this. I just want to finish up the lecture because I feel like it's good. Let's talk about the accelerated dragon for a sec. Because the dragon is also, this is the second best trap in chess, the accelerated dragon. This one I think gets so many players up to like even 1800 that it's incredible. Bishop e3, say knight c6, knight c3, knight f6, f3, castles, queen d2, and d5. Do you guys know this position? And white is already worse. It's like white is already trying to make a draw. Because what happened is white played like typical Yugoslav attack against the accelerated dragon, and this is the whole acceleration. The black didn't spend the move on d6. Okay, but what's the drawback to the accelerated dragon? Can anyone explain? Why don't all dragon players just play this variation? Because they wouldn't have to deal with the Yugoslav attack, most dangerous line against the dragon. They could just play the accelerated dragon, and white would have to figure out something else. Because they like getting checkmated. Yeah, that's exactly right. Okay, c4, exactly. So the real drawback is the Morrazy. Because in this position, white can play c4. So let's compare this to the normal dragon, right? In the normal dragon, black goes d6, d4, takes, knight f6. Very important move, actually. Attacking the pawn, forcing white to defend the pawn. Now black goes g6, but black has already committed this temp. So here we get this like typical Yugoslav attack line, right? Queen d2, knight c6, then white can play bishop c4 or castles. And after castles, of course, we all know hopefully best move here is d5. Playing this move, even though black is losing a tempo, this is how important the move is for black's counterplay. And in such a sharp position, you can imagine how bad it is to allow black to get this in one move when our king is still on e1. And it makes a big difference that the rook isn't on the d file. How bad is bishop d3 trying for Morrazy? I don't know the specifics of this one too much. Yeah, I would imagine e5 might be a problem here. Because on knight f5, again, we get d5. But it's an interesting idea. If you know your opponent is like a dragon player, then you can definitely try this one. But I should say that the bishop on d3 is not exactly the best square in the Morrazy. Usually this bishop wants to be on e2. But again, the point with this one is that black goes d5, and then if we take, well here, okay, yeah, it's not so much about taking the knight, but we'll have like maybe e4 or queen takes d5. This one I think black just gets like a pretty active position right off the bat. Yeah, and then maybe some e4 somewhere. No, it's a good question though. It's kind of important detail. So yeah, I'm not too familiar with this one, bishop d3, but that's probably because it's not a great move. But it's important to understand like why exactly, like what's the drawback of all of these different ideas. Okay, so here if black wants to force knight c3, then they have to play early d6. That's very important, right? And so in the accelerated dragon, if black wants to go for all this stuff and play this one, then they have to allow Morrazy. Morrazy, of course, is very playable, but this is not everyone's cup of tea, and I think most players kind of like white side in the Morrazy bind. For good reason. White gets space, gets to restrict opponent's counterplay, very pleasant position to play. Okay, so here is where it gets critical. Let's say black plays knight f6. Okay, e5 is again a blunder, right? Queen a5 check. So we got to go knight c3. And now let's say black plays bishop g7. Wanting accelerated dragon, and we've stopped the c-pawn. So there's no c4. What should white do here? Right, now we go e5. Very important. We gotta punish them. They can't get everything. If we play bishop e3, then black gets to play accelerated dragon after castles or knight c6, and doesn't even have to worry about the Morrazy bind. So that's not how it works. That's not how it works around here. So it's important to kind of punish the move order. Play e5, and now yeah, knight doesn't have good squares. Okay, but let's say black plays knight c6. Hey, Amza, Shinra, thanks for following. Yeah, here again you can go knight takes and e5. And I think there are some possibilities here for black to sacrifice a pawn with this one. But as far as I remember, it's not as good. We haven't moved our bishop yet because we're still defending this guy. So rook b8, there's no tempo. I think we're doing good. Does a knight c6 strengthen the center? Sure, it does, but the point is, if we allow black to get an accelerated dragon for free, we never had a chance to play c4, right? So this is the line where black goes knight f6. We don't get a chance to play c4 because we got to go knight c3. And now they're trying to play the accelerated dragon without d6. So there has to be a way to punish it. This is how you do it. So black must play d6. Well, that's the thing. If they either have to play knight f6 and d6, or they have to play neither of these moves. That makes sense. Like if you play knight f6 early, then you're always going to have to watch out for these e5 advances. But if you want to avoid that and play like bishop g7, then you allow white to play c4. So that's the trade-off. And then on knight f6, white can get developed behind the pawn, and white gets their lovely Morrazy. So you don't have to play d6, but if you want to play this way, and you don't want to allow this one, so basically if you want to play knight f6 early, at some point you're going to have to play d6 here, because on bishop g7 you get e5, and on knight c6 you just get takes and then e5. And sure, knight c6 allows black to play bc and capture towards the center, but we need it if we want to play e5, so no choice about that. That's kind of the point. Otherwise, black would take. Okay guys, hopefully that makes sense. We got a little derailed, but you know what? I just felt it was important for everyone to understand these minute details. What's my opinion on 6a3 line in the Najdorf? Well, yeah, I mean, let's talk about the Najdorf. Does anyone know why white messes around here with different moves? a3, knight b3, h3, bishop d3 was played. But specifically, this move a3 and this move knight b3. Does anyone know why knight b3 could possibly be good here, or like an interesting idea? Okay, Brayden says h3 is for g4, but not sure about a3. Chesterfish says to see if black goes e5 or e6. Yeah, this is exactly right. So a3, believe it or not, is actually connected with g4 as well. And knight b3 also connected with g4. Because it's all about the Keres attack. Yeah, exactly. Because in the past, they would just play e6 and they were like, oh, no problem. d6, e6, I control this square, I control this square, I control this one. That's how they thought about it. You know, they just made themselves a little hat, little Tetris shapes, and they were like, oh, good. And then Paul Keres came along and he was like, no, no, no. I'm gonna play g4 and ruin you with g5. And yeah, this was actually just like a brilliant idea and very, very strong. I mean, it's like, it's always playable. The engine will suggest some lines here, but the line itself was very dangerous. Now, pop quiz. Black in this position can go e5. What do you guys think white should do here? Because g4 pawn is now under attack. So yeah, knight f5 here is okay. I think this is playable. And bishop b5 is the other move. If I remember correctly, I kind of always liked bishop b5 a little bit more. Because we get to trade off these light squared bishops and we get our knight to f5. But these lines are a little bit weird. One way or another, knight comes to f5. Okay, so this one, you know, at some point was just considered to be quite dangerous for black. And of course, the Najdorf gained in popularity because this move is useful for black in every position. And black not only prepares e5, but also waits. Because if white plays like bishop e3, for example, and then black goes e6 and g4, this is a little bit different now because white doesn't necessarily want to play bishop e3 in all of these g4 lines. But also black can go e5. And then white can't go knight f5, has to play like knight b3, and then we get kind of like normal English attack stuff. We'll have to play like f3, g4. Okay, so what a couple of geniuses invented was just like play knight b3 here. And now the point is that if black goes e6, then we play g4, and we're good. We're getting our attack. And if black goes e5, well then we don't want to play bishop e3. We want to go bishop g5. Because the bishop is just much better on this square in this kind of structure, right? Because we're fighting for the d5 square. And okay, white can kind of like play for a little bit of an advantage here. I mean, it's not like crushing, but that's kind of the idea. So black has different options. They can go like knight c6 here. They can go g6. Of course, there's lots of different moves. And I feel like that's kind of the same idea with a3. It's just like a nice waiting move. If black goes e5, then actually here the point might be, sometimes the idea is to go knight f5 anyway. Because maybe there are some lines where bishop b4 is not such a huge problem. But I'm not really sure why. I feel like this would be okay for black. Knight f5 is the move here. But then, yeah, what's the idea after d5? Because I don't know this one. Oh, it's probably just bishop g5. Right. And usually black would like to play bishop b4 here, I would imagine. But now can't. And now, yeah, this is so like d4, knight d5. We get this kind of thing. Maybe. Who knows? Who knows what's going on? Bishop takes f5. Yeah, I don't know what's happening. Maybe we have to take on f6 first. Yeah, I don't know. Interesting. I don't really know the details of this one. Oh, bishop f6. Okay. So if this one, then we get knight d5, so gf, and then knight b1. Then the knight comes back out. That kind of makes sense, yeah. So is a3 the third best opening trap? It's not bad. I don't know if it's the third best, but it's not bad. Or knight b3. I think knight b3 is actually a very tricky choice against someone who like plays the Najdorf, because they're not gonna know what to do here. They're like, like what's my move? You know, e5 bishop g5 is unpleasant, e6 g4 is unpleasant. So what? They're gonna play a dragon? I don't think so. They're a Najdorf player. They're not gonna feel comfortable here. Think about yourself, guys, and the openings you play. Do you now want to play a different opening? I don't think so. So yeah, this one is kind of annoying. Okay, let's check in with our games. Maybe we got some moves.